So friends, how are you all? In our previous discussion, we had reached the point where, after understanding the depth of the Iran-Iraq War and the relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, we began talking about the start of the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. In the previous vlog, we had already seen how this war began, how the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan, and how this conflict, which was essentially a strategic war between the Soviet Union and the United States, a war between superpowers, led Saudi Arabia and Iran to start forming different strategies. So first, let us look at the role of Saudi Arabia in what was then called the Great Game in Afghanistan. In 1983, an alliance of 7 Afghan Islamic groups was formed. All 7 of these Afghan factions belonged to the Sunni sect, and except for one, the ethnicity of all of them was Pashtun. This alliance was called the Islamic Alliance of Afghan Mujahideen, or simply the Afghan Mujahideen. Because weapons and funding initially began coming from Saudi Arabia, a small following of the interpretation of Islam associated with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab had also begun to appear among some Pashtun communities in Afghanistan. These followers are commonly known as Wahhabis or Salafis. Friends, the leader of this Afghan Mujahideen alliance was made Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who had lived in Saudi Arabia for a long time. Sayyaf's own religious party, Ittihad-e-Islami, was also active in Afghanistan. It was widely believed that his organization received funding from Saudi Arabia. One reason for this perception was his close ties with the Saudi royal family and the similarity of his religious orientation with that of the Saudi establishment. Abdul Rasul Sayyaf was also the person who first invited Osama bin Laden to come to Afghanistan and offered him refuge. In recent years, Sayyaf has left armed struggle and entered politics, and he now spends most of his time in Afghanistan. So it was Abdul Rasul Sayyaf who, with the backing of Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Pakistan, became the head of the Afghan Mujahideen Alliance. He moved to Peshawar and from there led the organizational activities and the jihad against the Soviet Union. To push the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, a proxy war was launched. In this effort, large numbers of young men were recruited, especially from Pakistan, as well as from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Networks existed in colleges and universities for this purpose. However, the network of religious seminaries funded by Saudi Arabia, particularly those associated with the Wahhabi and Deobandi schools, became especially influential and expanded rapidly. Before the Afghan War against the Soviet Union, by the late 1970s, Pakistan had around 893 religious seminaries. During the period of General Zia-ul-Haq's martial law, when the war in Afghanistan was ongoing, this number increased to more than 2,800. According to a report by Dawn newspaper, most of these seminaries belonged to the Deobandi school of thought, and many of the Mujahideen who went to Afghanistan for training and fighting against the Soviet Union had connections with these institutions. To defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the American intelligence agency, CIA, launched the largest and most expensive operation in its history in the Third World. This operation was called Operation Cyclone. Under this program, after the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan, between $20 and $30 million per year were to be provided to the Mujahideen, and they were. During those days, the Afghan Mujahideen were viewed so positively in the United States that the American President Ronald Reagan invited them to the White House and held meetings with them seated beside him. There are many photographs and videos from that era available on the internet and published in books. As time passed, the funding increased. Operation Cyclone became more expensive. By the late 1980s, the amount provided to the Mujahideen had reached $600 to $700 million annually. In total, this amounted to more than $3 billion. This money came from the United States and was distributed under the supervision of General Zia-ul-Haq among those fighting the Soviet Union. In addition, Saudi Arabia had committed to matching whatever funds the United States provided. So Saudi Arabia, the United States, and several European countries collectively provided billions of dollars to the Mujahideen during this period. Saudi Arabia's intelligence agency, the General Intelligence Directorate, transferred funds to the bank account of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf's local organization, Ittihad-e-Islami. Additional funding also came from religious institutions, donation boxes placed in mosques and shops, and contributions from wealthy Saudi princes. A large portion of this funding was also used to spread the Saudi interpretation of Islam associated with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Saudi donors transferred funds to individuals and institutions they trusted, and donation boxes for the Afghan jihad were placed in many locations during the 1980s. This entire setup was part of a war against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, led in the Muslim world primarily by Saudi Arabia alongside the United States. Now let us look at the role of Iran in Afghanistan. When the Soviet Union crossed the Afghan border and entered Kabul, Ayatollah Khomeini strongly condemned the invasion. At the same time, Iran developed its own strategy against Soviet aggression. Under this strategy, Iran began supporting an Afghan organization known as the Revolutionary Council. This group was based in central Afghanistan in the mountainous region known as Hazarat, where large numbers of Hazara tribes live. The council established its own administration there, and Iran supported them with weapons and money. The council also had offices in Iran. The Hazara community in Afghanistan is a minority. While more than 42% of the population are Pashtuns and more than 27% are Tajiks, the Hazaras make up only about 9 to 10% of the population. They also belong largely to the Shia sect, which is the official sect in Iran. So during the Muslim Cold War on the Afghan front, Iran was supporting the Hazara-based Revolutionary Council, while Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United States were supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. Meanwhile, about 3 million Afghan refugees fled to Pakistan because of the Soviet invasion and the Civil War, while about 1 million Afghan refugees went to Iran. Unlike the Hazaras, most of the refugees who went to Iran were actually Sunnis. Because Pakistan shared a border with Afghanistan and hosted millions of refugees, it gained a strategic advantage in the Afghan conflict. Iran also gained a similar advantage by hosting refugees. Although Pakistan's position was stronger due to the backing of Saudi Arabia and the United States, Iran was also powerful due to its oil wealth. The Muslim Cold War had begun, but while the Soviet Union remained in Afghanistan, there was no major confrontation between these Muslim factions. But when the Soviet Union withdrew in February 1989 and the United States also withdrew its financial support, internal conflicts among Afghan groups began. Iran formed its own alliance of Afghan groups called Hizb-e-Wahdat, led by Hazara commander Karim Khalili. Just as Abdul Rasul Sayyaf received funding from Saudi Arabia, Khalili received funding and training from Iran. A new civil war began in Afghanistan. Previously, many jihadist groups had united to fight the Soviet Union and receive weapons from the United States. But after the Soviet withdrawal, huge stockpiles of weapons were left behind. Millions of dollars and large quantities of arms were available to different groups. The biggest question now was who would rule Afghanistan? Each faction believed it had made the greatest sacrifices and therefore deserved power. Violent clashes broke out between the groups. An international agreement attempted to establish a government in Afghanistan, but it failed to bring stability. Afghanistan remained trapped in civil war, with Afghan factions fighting each other while proxy wars between major Muslim countries continued. Eventually, a group of religious students led by Mullah Omar emerged. Over time, they became known as the Taliban. With support from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the Taliban captured Kabul in 1996. Most Taliban members had been trained by Pakistani agencies and studied in Deobandi seminaries in Pakistan. Many were also among the Afghan refugees who had come to Pakistan. The rise of the Taliban brought a degree of temporary stability to Afghanistan compared to the previous chaos. Because Pakistan and Saudi Arabia supported them, these two countries were among the first to recognize the Taliban government, along with the United Arab Emirates. No other country officially recognized them. With strong backing, the Taliban became the most powerful force in Afghanistan. However, another twist soon emerged. Several jihadist groups formed an alliance called the Northern Alliance to oppose the Taliban. This alliance included Ahmad Shah Massoud and also the Iran-backed group led by Karim Khalili. Interestingly, both Iran and the United States supported this alliance, even though they had previously been adversaries. India also provided financial assistance to this alliance. This shows that in many cases, the fundamental cause of conflicts was not religious sectarianism, but rather the strategic interests of states. Governments often used sectarian identities to pursue their own interests.
While this struggle continued in Afghanistan, its effects also spread into Pakistan, where Saudi Arabia and Iran began fighting proxy wars through local groups. At the same time, U.S. Middle East strategy had changed. Before the Iranian Revolution, the United States relied on three pillars in the region: Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran under the Shah. When the Iranian Revolution occurred, that third pillar collapsed. The United States then replaced Iran with Pakistan in its regional strategy. That is why Pakistan became a frontline state during the Soviet-Afghan War. General Zia-ul-Haq introduced Islamic reforms in Pakistan during this period, including the Zakat and Ushur system in 1980. However, Shia scholars opposed these reforms, arguing that their sect already had its own religious obligations. Large protests occurred in Islamabad under the leadership of Allama Arif Hussain al-Husseini, and eventually the government agreed to exempt Shias from the system. But tensions continued to grow. Sectarian organizations emerged,
including Sipah-e-Sahaba and Sipah-e-Muhammad. Assassinations and retaliatory killings followed, and sectarian violence spread across Pakistan. By the 1990s, these conflicts had caused significant unrest. In Karachi alone, around 800 people were killed in sectarian violence in 1996. The violence also affected cultural figures, doctors, and scholars. Pakistan began experiencing deep internal divisions as proxy conflicts influenced domestic politics. The 1980s and 1990s were therefore a painful period, marked by internal wars, Cold War rivalries, and proxy conflicts across the Muslim world. Finally, in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, bringing another chapter of conflict into the region and again involving the United States. Friends, this discussion has already become quite long. We will continue examining the modern history of the Muslim world in the next episode. I would like to emphasize once again that in this series, we are not judging the ideologies of Islamic countries or organizations. We are simply presenting the historical events that shaped the Muslim world as it exists today. The conclusions are for you to draw. Thank you.